to set the world on fire. I just want to start a flame in your heart.
Hello and welcome to the second podcast of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes. Today's episode will feature John H. McGoran's remembrances of the USS California, which was moored on Battleship Row on Pearl Harbor, the day of infamy. During the 1990s, while I was a teacher with the Department of Defense schools in Bad Kreuznach, Germany, I began writing to veterans of World War II to thank them for the sacrifices they made for our freedom. I also encouraged them to share their stories with me, and I promised that I would pass them on to the students that I taught. What I didn't realize was that veterans would share my letters with their friends and print them in reunion newsletters. Before long, I was corresponding with 140 veterans, 20 of which received the Medal of Honor. I had way more material than I could ever use in the classes that I taught, and so I wrote the book, Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, to keep my promise to them. And these podcasts are based on that book and are another way that I'm keeping my promise to keep their stories alive. The stillness of dawn was shattered as the Japanese launched a massive attack on the US Naval base of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and with it the fragile peace that the United States had precariously maintained amid gathering war clouds. The unsuspecting Americans at Pearl Harbor, just waking on Sunday morning, washing, bathing, dressing for church, could not have been more surprised as 360 Japanese bombers and fighters were launched against them in the space of only 2 short hours. Japanese Rear Admiral Yamamoto's bold plan to launch a devastating surprise attack was almost ensured of success, with 7 out of the U.S. Pacific Fleet's 8 unsuspecting battleships moored at Ford Island's Battleship Row. In addition to the battleships, there were 86 lesser ships packed together in the harbor, an area not quite 3 miles square, with only one channel at the open sea. Battleship Row was devastated. Within a few horrific hours, the Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, Nevada, Utah, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Tennessee would all be badly damaged. Worst hit was the Arizona, which took a bomb directly into its forward magazine, igniting over 1 million tons of explosives. Sunk at her berth, burned and blasted in two, the Arizona would claim 1,177 Navy sailors and Marines, representing the greatest loss of life in a single explosion up to that point in history. The Oklahoma, struck by 9 aerial torpedoes, would capsize and sink within just 20 minutes. The West Virginia, hit by 6 torpedoes and 2 bombs, would burn through most of Sunday afternoon before sinking into the mud of Pearl Harbor. Seeing the devastation all around her and already reeling from the hit of 1 torpedo, the Nevada made a desperate attempt to escape the channel. Hit again and again by 5 more torpedoes, the Nevada was forced to give up her drive as she began sinking, still managing to keep the channel clear for other ships by maneuvering herself over to Hospital Point. The California agonized for 3 days, clinging to life before she too sank, the result of 2 torpedoes and 2 bombs that struck her, killing 96 officers and crew members. However, the destruction the Japanese wrought at Pearl Harbor was not limited to Battleship Row. The Utah, moored at the opposite side of Ford Island, suffered 3 torpedoes which caused her to roll over and sink, suffocating the 58 men trapped in her hull. The men of the Utah, like hundreds of others on the Oklahoma and West Virginia, were marooned in darkness, kept alive for days by pockets of air in their capsized battleships, unable to help themselves, praying for an uncertain rescue. Banging on the hull of their ships, a lucky few were rescued, but hundreds more died in the darkness or in failed rescue attempts as the scarce air they craved was sucked out. The West Virginia became a grave for 3 such men who, trapped inside an airlocked storeroom, kept a tally of how long they survived. The tally ended the day before Christmas Eve, 1941. Hangar No. 6 on Ford Island fell under intense bombing and strafing through the attack. Sea fighter and land-based aircraft were destroyed by incendiary bombs that wreaked a terrible toll. Of the 202 Navy planes on Oahu, 150 were destroyed. 38 courageous American pilots took their planes into the air to fight back. 10 were shot down, but they contributed to bringing down the 29 Japanese planes lost in the attack. In the aftermath of the bloody attack, loss of life was staggering. 2,638 officers and enlisted men were dead, including 68 civilians. 1,178 more men were wounded. Many of them suffered terrible burns. Pearl Harbor's hospital was overwhelmed. Men like Lieutenant Commander Herman Gross rose to the occasion. Gross had just undergone a major operation 3 days prior to the attack, but seeing the badly injured men piling into the hospital for help, he insisted on leaving his bed and treating the casualties. He worked for 3 days straight until he collapsed at a wounded man's bedside, becoming a patient again himself. There were so many dead that the enlisted men's pool in the village of Afire, just across from Arizona, was turned into a temporary graveyard. The dead were piled there until they could be identified and buried. John McGoran of Corte Madera, California, then a sailor on the USS California, didn't hear the alarm that sounded general quarters that December 7th morning. His breakfast over, he was carrying his dirty dishes to the scullery when a sailor ran by him singing crazily, "The Japs are coming! Hurrah! Hurrah!" McGoran rushed to his battle station in the very bottom of the ship, the lower powder handling room of No. 3 turret. No. 3 turret was a big rotating turret with 14-inch guns that fired 4-foot-long shells capable of hurling some 22 miles. When fired, the bang is a doomsday clap of thunder that gave me the hearing loss that I remember them today. As he was trained to do, McGoran rushed to the deck below, jumped into an open hatchway, caught the lower deck's overboard bar, then swung onto another run in the lower passageway. Quick as he could, he arrived in the lower handling room, where a first-class petty officer named Allen had taken charge. Allen was one of those old-time petty officers referred to as the backbone of the fleet. Now he was busily giving orders, as we couldn't carry them out because no one had the keys to the powder magazines. Suddenly, a violent lurching shook us all, tossing us around like so many unmuscled puppets, as the ship seemed to raise a foot and then settled down. Allen grabbed at his earphones. "We're hit!" he cried. "A torpedo!" At first, McGoran didn't care. The armor around the California was a foot thick, and the ship was thought to be impenetrable. McGoran's first thought was, "So what? Enjoy it." He didn't think a torpedo could sink the mighty California. McGoran soon realized how wrong he was. "My idiot elation was brief," McGoran recalled years later. "The fuel tank next to our port magazine was in flames, and there we were, surrounded on 3 sides by powder-filled magazines." If the flames touched off the magazines, the whole ship might be destroyed. Orders came immediately to check the temperature of the wall between the magazines and the fuel tank. When the men forced open the lock and opened the door to the magazines, they found ripped sacks of gunpowder strewn across the floor. McGoran recalled, "Fearfully I entered, walking carefully over the debris to feel the bulkhead. Then I returned, reporting to Allen that the wall was cool. Allen in turn passed the reassuring word over the mouthpiece of his headset to the bridge. Whatever reply came back over the phones was reflected in the strain on Allen's face. He couldn't seem to comprehend. Perhaps he didn't want to believe. He turned to us and almost in a whisper said, "The Oklahoma, it's capsized." Before the news really had time to sink in, Allen was told over his headset of a possible fire in the upper handling room, accessed by a vertical ladder leading up from the lower handling room. McGoran volunteered to check it out, carrying a fire extinguisher up the ladder. The report turned out to be false. Upon reaching the upper handling room, McGoran found no fire and no people. Tired from his trek up the ladder, and just beginning to comprehend the enormity of the unfolding disaster, McGoran took a moment to contemplate. "No one will believe all this when I tell them someday, and since I have no memory for dates, it will really sound silly." So I sat down, and with my pocket knife, I scratched on the back of my wristwatch, "Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. Back in the lower handling room, it was evident that the California's situation was indeed grave. The ship was listing heavily to port, despite the engine room's work to even the ship's keel. An anti-aircraft ammunition supply line had also broke repeatedly in the CL compartment, familiar to McGoran as his sleeping quarters. McGoran and 2 other sailors agreed to do what they could do to fix the line. As McGoran prepared to set off, the lights in our handling room flickered and went out. For a few moments we were in total darkness. The red battle lamps went on, dimly, but giving enough light so I could make my way about. The narrow passageway to the compartment was treacherous, even in the best of times, with watertight bulkhead doors lined with a conveyor system to move the heavy shells up hoists that lifted them to the 5-inch guns located above on the boat's deck. Because of the dim lighting, McGoran and the 2 other sailors made their way cautiously through the passageway, reaching the CL compartment without any trouble. McGoran was shocked by what awaited him there. As each man looked into the CL compartment, he turned and backed off. Then came my turn, and what I saw was pure horror. My first realization that this game was now for keeps. I saw bodies, many bodies, some of which I knew, just by their eyes, were lifeless. Thunderous booms began rocking the ship, adding to the sailors' horror. They thought the explosions were Japanese bombs hitting the California's armor deck, but later found out that they were from the ship's 5-inch guns, being fed their ammunition from ready boxes alongside them. McGoran soon found himself helping rescue a man that he detested. As I stood there looking into CL compartment, my companion, a seaman named Smitty, called to me. I turned to see him on the opposite side of the conveyor, trying to help a sailor whose back was against the bulkhead, Navy talk for wall, but who was slowly slipping to the floor. His eyes were rolled back in his head. "This one is alive," Smitty said calmly. Smitty was a small fellow, but he managed to wrestle the wounded sailor to me, and I pulled the limp body over the conveyor into the passageway. Now, if on December 6 anyone had asked me to help save the life of this offensive guy, I would have answered, "To hell with him." I had known this fella since boot camp, and he was one of the most overbearing characters I have ever met. But now unconscious, he had no personality. His life was a life to be saved. Recognizing that this disagreeable sailor was badly in need of help, Smitty and McGoran backtracked towards the first aid station. Bogged down by the man's weight, it was a difficult journey, opening and closing watertight hatch covers and hoisting the injured sailor up the ladder. McGoran hadn't gone far when he discovered that things could always get worse. Smitty took the injured man's legs and started up the ladder. I got him under the arms, and just as I'd taken a second or third step upward, an explosion again rocked the ship. Compressed air from the deck above thrust the 3 of us back down the ladder, landing us in a pile at the bottom. Picking myself up, I found my right leg had a laceration. Blood was oozing from my shin. Listening to one explosion after another, McGoran and Smitty decided it wasn't such a good idea after all to head towards the main deck and close the hatch cover. Just then, to add to their confusion, A sailor yelled, "Gas!" as a steam pipe burst. McGoran, like the men around him, held his breath and put on his gas mask. McGoran found the mask unpleasant and was glad to find the air smelled okay when he lifted it a few minutes later. The air soon cleared. McGoran wished the horrors surrounding him could so easily be lifted. 3 Negroes, men that we had thought were dead, staggered towards us from that gruesome morgue, the CL compartment we had just left. 2 of these men were helping a third, who kept repeating insanely, "Moses is dead! Moses is dead!" Moses Anderson Allen. Moses was a large man, an officer's mess attendant. He was liked by everyone on board, and the Negro crewmen looked up to him as their leader. Smitty and I debated whether to try for escape from this area by going back to and beyond the CL compartment to a hatch there, or opening this hatch again and trying for an escape here. We hesitantly tackled this latter. We opened the hatch cover again, and we saw no evidence of damage from the explosion. Still carrying their injured shipmate, McGoran and Smitty soon reached the ship's store, which was a complete mess. A bomb had penetrated the deck above, and had exploded there, killing the master-at-arms, a sailor named Boots. McGoran and Smitty hoisted the injured sailor up another ladder, this time arriving at a makeshift emergency first aid station. McGoran found triage operations were already underway in what had previously been the recreation room for the crew. We laid our patient on the floor. A chief petty officer, whom I recognized as one of the Black Gang engine room crew, came over and with great authority asked if he was alive. "We think so," I said. "Then get him out of the way," ordered the chief. "Slide him under the table where somebody can't trip on him." Then the chief went back to directing and sorting the living from the dead. As men were brought down, shipmates in, the chief would say, "Dead or alive? If they're dead, take them to the other room and throw them on the dead pile." He repeatedly made rounds of the room inspecting bodies. "This man is dead. Get him out of here." Normally, the cold, hard manner would have been resented. Now, I could only feel admiration for his efficiency. Although 50 men had died in the explosion from the anti-aircraft ammunition magazine alone, the shipmate that McGoran carried could count himself as one of the lucky ones. A week after the day that would live in infamy, McGoran learned that his shipmate was recovering with a broken back. Standing in the first aid station, amid the chaos of the dead and dying, McGoran realized that he was hungry, and he gladly accepted a bottle of root beer and a sandwich when offered one by a fellow soldier. As he ate, he watched, numb, as one of the California's pilots hurried across the room, slipped on its bloody deck, and fell onto several wounded men. Even at this time, McGoran wondered how he could be hungry amidst this carnage. I watched, and feeling nothing, I wondered, does nature have the power of anesthesia, or is this shock? McGoran recalled that Father McGuire, Catholic chaplain for the fleet, and credited with having said, "Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition," during the attack, entered the first aid station and headed towards the demolished ship's store. McGuire was wearing a gas mask on his head, which reminded McGoran of a strangely shaped hat. Because the men of the California could not reach their own supply of anti-aircraft ammunition, a chief petty officer and a warrant officer ordered a work party of 10 men to search for ammunition. McGoran was chosen to be on the work party, which left the first aid station for starboard quarter deck. We were about to proceed on across the unprotected quarter deck to board a motor launch when someone warned us that a wave of strafing Japanese planes was passing overhead. The planes came in low, and between sorties, men from nearby battle stations would race out on the quarterdeck to drag to shelter the men struck by machine gun fire. Then, as soon as we felt it was safe enough, we ran for the motor launch. As the work party rushed to the motor launch, they realized the ladder was no longer necessary to reach it. The California had sunk so low in the water that all they had to do was jump from the quarterdeck to the motor launch. Led by Warrant Officer H.A. Applegate and B.F. Pavlin, the work party began its desperate search for ammunition, taking a harrowing ride across Battleship Row, still under fire, many of its ships mortally wounded. The coxswain, also known as the steersman, directed the raft towards the Maryland, astern to the California, because she was the closest ship and seemed to be undamaged. The coxswain steered their boat between the Oklahoma, now belly up after having rolled over, men were still trapped helplessly inside, and the forecastle of the Maryland, which contained the sailors' living quarters. The work crew shouted up to the sailors of the Maryland that they needed ammunition, but to no avail. The plight of one work party in need of ammunition and a tiny motor launch seemed to be the least of the worries of the Maryland sailors. It didn't seem worth their while to board the Maryland, so the coxswains steered their tiny craft to the USS West Virginia, which was sinking so quickly that Applegate and a party of 5 he selected could climb aboard without the use of a ladder. McGoran remained in the boat, its engine still running, to keep it alongside the West Virginia without actually tying up to her. As he watched Applegate and his men cross under the big 16-inch guns and disappear starboard side, McGoran was shocked when suddenly the forecastle shot up in smoke and flames. An officer in his white uniform appeared engulfed in the fire. Someone on board shouted for us to get out of here. This ship can blow up at any minute. The coxswain didn't need to be told twice. He was in such a hurry to back up the launch that he didn't notice that he was heading straight into the belly-up Oklahoma's huge propeller. McGoran tried to warn him. I yelled at the coxswain to reverse engines. At the same time, 2 of us clambered to the tiller deck and scrambled over the taffrail. When one hand grasping the taffrail, we stretched out with our legs, and with our feet we reached to shove against the Oklahoma's propeller. The effort prevented damage to our motor launch. As the coxswain pulled away from the propeller, the crew spotted a sailor in the water, struggling to avoid the burning oil that was fast closing in on him. The coxswain declared that he was going after the man. Fearful that the West Virginia was going to explode at any minute, another sailor objected to the rescue, as did McGoran himself. The coxswain ordered them both tiller deck and proceeded with the rescue. Somewhat embarrassed, McGoran recalled, I complained no more, and I stayed right where I was. Actually, I was becoming so frightened, I don't think I could have moved. The coxswain quickly picked up the sailor and got out of there. Many years later, at a Pearl Harbor survivors' luncheon in October of 1985, McGoran met the very man he plucked out of the water that day, Joseph Paul. The coxswain spotted the USS St. Louis, which had backed out of the Navy Yard and was making a break for it, hoping to escape to the open sea. The little launch came alongside the St. Louis, and McGoran and the crew tried to board her, using a gangway that was hanging from her side. An officer denied them permission, though, and the coxswain turned his launch back towards the naval shipyard. At last, the launch stopped at 1010 dock, and the ammunition party went their separate ways. Despite getting separated from the crew they had assembled to find ammunition, Warrant Officer Applegate and B.F. Pavlin would both survive and would receive a commendation for their attempt to find ammunition while under fire. John McGoran found his way to the Navy Yard's administration building and reported for duty. He was assigned to a work crew under the leadership of the wife of the West Virginia's gunnery officer, Claude Ricketts. He was told to report to the Honolulu YMCA, where he spent the rest of the evening of the day that would live in infamy, helping the women and children evacuated from the Pearl Harbor housing project. In the days that followed, Pearl Harbor went to work, salvaging what could be saved from the battleships, burying the dead, and tending to the wounded. There were so many bodies that even the enlisted men's pool at the village of Aiea was used as a temporary grave. Inevitably, McGoran learned of the deaths of the men that he knew. Boot, master of arms, was killed in the explosion at the ship's store, the same catastrophe that tumbled 3 of us off the ladder down on the 3rd deck. Simmons, a friend since boot camp, had died in the ship's brig, where he had been confined for a minor infraction of the ship's rules. One rule or another kept Simmons in trouble, and it became a standing joke to call the brig Simmons Inn. A Marine sentry failed to release him, as he was required to do, whenever general quarters was sounded. It was no place to visit, and it was surely no place to die. McGoran, like many other sailors, was given a cot in the days that followed the attack in an airline hangar alongside Ford Island's runway. As he was walking one night, he saw a friend of his named Pullen. I warmly greeted Pullen, slapping him on the back. Pullen had an identical twin brother, Roy Alford, aboard, and the two were devoted to each other. When you saw one, you knew the other was nearby. They were two of the hardest workers when ordered on a working party. Never a minute did they shirk a duty. Pullen sat in a pitiful trance, staring fixedly into space. Someone whispered to me, "Knock it off! Haven't you heard? Pullen's identical twin brother Roy had been killed in the attack." 1 week after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, McGoran was assigned to the USS Detroit, a light cruiser that would become his home until the end of the war. The Detroit would participate in the retaking of the Amchitka, Attu, Kiska, and Aleutian Islands. Aboard the Detroit, McGoran would have the unusual distinction of being an eyewitness not only to the start of the war in Pearl Harbor, but also to its end, as the Detroit entered Tokyo Bay on September 1st, 1945, and anchored alongside the USS Missouri to observe the surrender ceremony the following day. Our song today, I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire, became very popular in the days after Pearl Harbor. Also, John McGoran himself passed away at the age of 82, on June 24th, 2005. Thank you for joining us for this podcast of Always Remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes, and please join me again for future podcasts, which will be released approximately bi-weekly, and check out the book on Amazon.com. Thank you, John Alfords. Always remember World War II Through Veterans' Eyes.